Hello everyone and welcome to the game of the day. First day of the finals here at the Chess24 Legends of Chess event. We had a very expected match today between Jan Nepomniachtchi, Magnus Carlsen, two players born in the same year, guys who know each other very well. And Jan is the kind of player whose style is very aggressive, kind of unpredictable, plays some very risky openings. That's the kind of player that can sometimes cause trouble just because he is so dangerous. And so today, we're going to look, as a game of the day, we're actually going to kind of look at both games where Jan had the white pieces because they featured the same opening, and therefore it makes sense to kind of look at both of them together. The official game of the day will be the second one, but we're going to look at both. So play started with e4 here today, and Magnus has been playing the Najdorf quite a bit in this tournament, and he did play it another time, another couple times in fact today against Jan. And so here we go. These are the starting moves. And now Jan plays rook g1, a move that was sort of not seen very often until the last few years. And there have been a couple of players who have tried it quite a bit. Amusingly enough, one of them has been Magnus Carlsen. He wasn't the first one to sort of try it out again, but he did play it a few times recently. And it's sort of a weird looking move, right? Of all the possible moves, almost everything here is playable for white, right? You can try almost anything. A4, knight b3. I mean, they've played h3. They've tried everything. But rook g1 is an interesting one. The idea is clearly to play g4, and white is actually saying, you know what? If I'm going to play for this g4 move anyway, I might as well put my rook on g1, where it's likely to be very useful. And instead of playing f3, and maybe I don't need to play f3, and maybe I'm saving a tempo. So it's an interesting little move. But on the other hand, it's a little bit slow, right? It's going to take rook g1, then g4, then g5 to create something. So normally in a Najdorf, black has two ways to respond aggressively, and these are the two ways that black has generally played here. The first one is b5, which is what Magnus plays here. And the second one would be to play e5, which is years back when basically if white did not do anything to prevent it, namely bishop g5 or bishop c4, which both kind of play against the d5 square, then e5 is a very good response. And so there have been some games with e5. Magnus had a few blitz games here that went with knight b3. There was one game, for example, against Sugirov in the Banter Blitz Cup on chess24 that went like this, and so on. This is a totally different line. But here, Magnus as black plays b5, which kind of immediately creates this threat of potentially playing b4, trying to go after the e4 pawn, but also potentially just to play bishop b7, sort of immediately pressure this pawn and make white play f3. And if white is forced to play both f3 and rook g1, then arguably their setup was not ideal. But on b5, Jan immediately plays g4. Black plays bishop b7, and so he's threatening the e4 pawn. And now Jan simply plays g5. So it's a real pawn sacrifice here. He is sort of offering this pawn. In the first game, so we're going to look at the first game first, sort of briefly, just the opening part of it to see what happens. In the first game, Magnus thought for a while here, clearly felt like his opponent had prepared something, and went for the safer move, knight fd7. Now, when you play knight fd7, though, it seems like white has essentially achieved what they want, which is they've managed to play g4, g5 without losing a pawn. They've achieved it without wasting any time with their f or h pawn, so it seems like a success. In that game, Jan then played a3, a move that has used to kind of be frowned upon to play with a3, but now in these kind of aggressive Sicilians, they like to secure the knight on c3, avoid any nonsense with b4. And now Magnus played g6. He could also have tried to develop with e6. I think that's what Judith Polgar in the broadcast was expecting. But he played with g6, also playable. h4, bishop g7, h5. And it looks like white is pretty fast here. That being said, Magnus survived. He played knight c6, bishop e3, and knight c5. And here it's curious. It would be interesting to see if Jan maybe in another game, if he got the same position, would have played h6, which sort of forces these trades. Probably e5, because otherwise that queen is really good on this diagonal. Probably e5, queen, let's say e3. And we have an interesting position where the d5 square is weak, but black is not without counterplay. They probably can castle kingside and try to play f6 and eventually get a piece like a rook or a queen on f4. Doesn't seem that bad for black. So in the game, instead of playing h6, Jan played f3. Black castled. And it seems like Magnus actually survived, and even more so after h takes g6, which I think was a mistake. Pawn takes g6 with the f pawn, which opened up the f file. And now, with also the idea that sometimes black can play and double these pawns for white, black got a pretty comfortable position, and Magnus went on to win that first game. So, but in the second game, he actually decided to kind of take the bull by the horn here and take the pawn on e4, which is certainly the critical test of this setup for white playing quickly g4, g5. But now Jan had some interesting preparation. He plays knight takes e4, bishop takes e4, and here he plays a4. And I think that move is actually new, and Jan blitzed it out extremely fast, so clearly had some preparation here. I think other moves have been tried, like queen to g4. There was actually a really nice line here that Alexander Grishchuk, who prepared this, I guess, in connection with Fedoseev, a strong Russian grandmaster who's played this line, showed this variation, which is just one of the possibilities. There's a lot of options for both players, but this is a fun line to see. Bishop takes g2. Maybe the best move is something like queen c7 to avoid what happens here. Queen takes g2. We're attacking the rook. And now if black plays the most natural move, which is knight to d7, white has a really nice tactic here, g6. And with that move, the threat is of course to try to open up the light squares here against the king. And on pawn takes g6, there's a beautiful move here, knight to e6, which creates a potential quick mate here. And then if the queen moves, we have queen takes a8 followed by the knight fork. So white ends up better in this variation. But there are a lot of other possibilities for black. And so Jan plays a4, which is sort of an interesting move, immediately trying to weaken the black queen side. And now Magnus plays e5, which is a move that looks very tempting, but seeing the game continuation, maybe a move that kind of keeps things a little bit more closed up, like b4, even if that pawn will eventually fall, could be interesting. But Magnus reacts in a very logical way. He plays e5, tries to force the knight to move away, and he may have been surprised here by Jan's response, which was to simply take on b5 and sacrifice a piece. This is the second sort of piece, offering that Magnus decided not to take. In the first game, he didn't take the pawn here on e4. And in this game, he decided not to take this knight. I do think, having looked at it afterwards, that taking the knight is probably the critical way to play. But it is really hard to play this in a game because your opponent is prepared. Jan has blitzed this out really fast. Queen takes d4. And now maybe queen e7 is the move to try to create some play here. And now there's different ways. White is going to be down a piece for a while here, but they may get a second pawn at some point. Now the question is, do you play rook g3 with the idea rook e3, or do you play something like bishop e3 just to prevent the bishop from giving a check here by moving, and then eventually you'll take this pawn? Either way, it's clear white has compensation, but it is hard to know whether it's more than enough. It might be enough, it might not be enough, hard to say. Computer gives it about equal, which is always sort of hard to believe that if of all the possible evaluations it's just equal. And the computer sort of likes this setup, playing the rook to e3 with a messy position, looks at endgames starting with queen e5 that are very complicated, where you take and then you take this pawn and then you see what happens. But it is a mess. In the game, Magnus decides not to take this knight, plays the safer bishop e7. Reasonable choice. I don't think it's bad. But now Jan plays a really nice move, actually. A move that impressed me. He plays rook to g4. And I don't know if this was still preparation, but this is a really cool move. What he's trying to do is force that bishop to move so that once that bishop moves, most likely on this, somewhere on this, along this long diagonal, then it will vacate the f5 square for the knight, which is a really good square. So a nice move. And then the tactical point of it is that if black plays d5, then white suddenly has a really powerful position after the exchange sacrifice. Rook takes bishop, pawn takes rook, and knight f5. And this is one of those sacrifices that works even though queens are getting traded. Like the queen trade here does not actually help black very much. Material here is white is down an exchange, but they're likely to pick up a pawn on a6. Well, they will pick up a pawn on a6 at least. And also they have just really nice squares, and eventually they'll have maybe 3 passed pawns if they take this one that are connected. And so it does look like it's actually just much better for white. I looked at something like bishop c5, and then probably the simplest is just to take on g7, wait to take the a6 pawn because that one's not going anywhere. Something like king f8, knight f5, and yeah, white just seems to be much better here by taking this pawn next. These e-pawns, by the way, even if you take on f2, these e-pawns are really not too scary, especially with the monster knight on f5. They're not going anywhere. So Magnus doesn't play d5, allowing that strong exchange sacrifice. Instead, he takes on b5, which is a nice little tactical move, right? Like the bishop is not really, you can't take the bishop with white because the rook on a1 would hang. So it's a nice tactical move. So Jan takes the pawn with check, very natural. Knight d7, don't want the king to be stuck on f8. We still have the same idea, right? This bishop is immune because of the rook. But now Jan makes another move, which I really liked. He plays bishop to d2, and it's not that this is such a hard move. It's not like it's such a complicated move, but it is a hard move to see, in my opinion, because it's more natural to move the rook than to defend it in this way. But a nice move. Now, the rooks are staring at each other. The knight is attacked. The bishop is attacked. This is a completely messy position. So Magnus plays bishop to b7. There was also this. I think it was in this position that they were analyzing to move bishop h1, trying to keep the bishop on this side of the board, which also leads to really complicated play. White can play either knight c6 or knight f5 here, and it's a really messy position. But bishop b7, a reasonable move. Now Jan plays knight f5, which was his idea. Black castles. Amazingly, after castles, black is in a little bit of trouble. It's possible that the move g6 would have been an interesting attempt. It's hard to play that in a game because you immediately see that the knight is coming to h6 and the king is never going to castle with that knight here. So it looks pretty dangerous, especially since that knight is pinned. That being said, black can try to play something like king f8 to g7, what they call castling by hand sometimes. And the position is messy. It looks like white has a bit of a pull if they play extremely accurately, but it doesn't seem easy at all. In the game, Magnus castles, and now there is a bizarre computer move that yields an advantage for white, but to find this is really tough. I'm not going to tell you to pause the video because this you almost have to be a computer to find this one. The move is rook to a4, and this is a bizarre move because when you look at the position here, it looks like white is going to play on the king side, right? It just seems like you're going for like rook h4, queen h5 is the idea. Maybe knight h6 check. You have all these attacking possibilities. And to instead say, you know what, I'm going to focus on the queen side is really tough. The idea of this move, there's a couple of ideas. One is that in some cases, once the rooks get traded, there's bishop a5, which can really kind of embarrass this black queen. Another idea is that also after rook trades, the rook can come to a7. That can also be a really powerful square because there's 3 pieces, the bishop on b7, the knight on d7, and the bishop on e7. So a lot of pieces on this 7th rank. And so that move does seem to be very strong. And after rook takes a4, rook takes a4, there isn't really a good defense. So much so that the computer likes to simply play down a piece in this manner. Amazingly, this bishop defends both the knight, the rook, kind of defends everything. And even though black has a threatening check, here you want to be careful not to blunder into king e2, bishop f3 with a skewer. But after king d2, king c1, suddenly white is actually very safe and just winning. But instead of this, Jan plays rook takes a8, bishop takes a8, and he plays rook h4. Now, rook h4 is another move that potentially was not the most accurate, but it seems so natural that it's very hard to blame Jan for this one. The idea again is that bishop takes g5, similarly to the other variation, doesn't really work because of the knight hanging on d7. And it seems like the best move, this is one that is even hard to explain, is to play king f1. We'll actually see this idea in two moves, so I'll wait on explaining it. But after rook h4, black plays g6. You got to do something to stop queen h5, which is a very serious threat. That would, by the way, then black would meet h6 with knight takes h6, kind of opening everything up and definitely winning. So black plays g6 to stop queen h5. Now Jan plays queen g4, which is a really nice attacking move again. The idea is that pawn takes f5 would fail to either queen takes or queen h5 with queen h7. So after queen g4, Magnus plays knight c5, a multi-purpose move, right? The knight can sometimes come to e6, which is going to be a nice defensive square. It also removes the attack, right? Because white was actually threatening here to take that knight, either by first taking on d7 or taking on e7 first and then taking it. So that knight moves out of the way. It also allows black to sometimes have this defensive resource, bishop e4, which can be really useful, trying to bring another piece to the king side. And now Jan plays a very, very natural move, queen to h3. And the move served him well. However, there was a surprisingly strong move, king f1 again. For the second move in three moves, this move king f1 is extremely strong. So first of all, I'm going to ask you if you can see the idea. And if you want to pause the video for a second, see if you find the most direct threat of this move, king f1. So the threat is to play bishop to a5. And the idea is that once the queen moves, so let's say black just makes a move here, bishop a5, the queen has to take this bishop, knight takes e7 check, the king can move to either g7 or h8, it actually doesn't change anything. Either way, white takes on h7, which forces a capture, and then it's a nice but forced mate here. So this is the point of king f1, and it's difficult to respond to, right? Like knight e6, for example, still is met by this move, and now the knight is forced to come to this really passive square to just avoid losing the bishop. And finally, h5, which is what was played in the game in the other position, leads to the same. If h5 instead of knight e6 is the same sort of position as we'll get in the game. So in a game, by the way, Magnus was very low on time here, and that's probably why he was not able to calculate the best move. So Jan put a lot of pressure on him with this opening, and this sort of piece sacrifice early on. It's very hard to reply quickly to this stuff. So Magnus was already down under a minute, and Jan still had plenty of time here. So Magnus played h5, and we'll see that this is not the best move in hindsight. Well, let's just look at h5 first. So after h5, Jan plays a very strong rook takes h5, which Magnus must have underestimated when he was low on time. The problem is, so right now rook h8 is a threat, so he's got to take. And then after queen takes, the problem is that there's this queen h6 threat with queen g7, but there's also the threat of g6, and this is probably what Magnus missed in his calculation, because he may have thought that he had to move bishop e4, but here g6 actually forces pretty much instant mate here. You can't take on f5 because of queen h7 mate, and pawn takes g6, queen takes with queen g7 mate, so it's just over here. So Magnus played knight e6 and actually resigned, I think, before white would play g6, which was his threat anyway. So of course Jan would have played it, and the game would end something like this. You check first on h6, right? And then take on e6 with check. And then on rook f7, you can play, the easiest is knight h6 and then take that rook. The game will be over. So yeah, that was the end of the game. But after queen h3, there's actually some crazy variations that are really fun to look at. And so let's look at them and see if Magnus could have defended here. And the move is bishop takes g5. The idea of this move is of course to give the king a little bit of chance to move, right? And so after rook takes h7, which is really the only move, you don't want to take on g5 first because that lets the queen out. And after rook takes h7, now you start to have checks that are probably going to win. If not, g takes f5 might also be a good move, but the checks are annoying. So white would play rook takes h7 first, then bishop takes d2. Really, the king has to take, because on king d1, for example, white is not quite threatening mate here, especially with that bishop covering an important square. And here, all this is a couple checks. The king will run away, and white is running out of ammunition here. So going back here after bishop takes g5, queen takes g5. Yeah, so after bishop takes g5, rook takes h7, bishop takes d2. White would take on d2, then queen g5 check, have to bring that queen out. And now it looks like in most cases, the game can actually end in some crazy draws. Not easy to see at all, but there's two moves here, king c3 and knight e3. We'll look at knight e3 first, trying to play rook h8 and queen h7, win material. Black actually manages to bring the knight in the game here, king c1. Best move, otherwise there's a forks. And then the only move actually for black is to bravely take on f2, but that does attack the queen, it attacks the knight, so it forces white to go for this variation, king f6. Now white's not checkmating here, so they got to take material, and we have a position like this, which is honestly just a mess, because after king b1 there's actually a nice defensive move here, bishop d5 protects everything. Well, really the only thing that needs to be protected is the f7 pawn. And the position is complicated. The computer says it's going to be a draw eventually. Otherwise, on queen g5 check, there was the possibility to play king c3, and now we have sort of a king walk or hunt or whatever we want to call it. And it looks like it ends in a draw again after king a3, queen a5, bishop a4, queen c5. And so this is all extremely difficult to see. Queen c4, and then there's a perpetual king a3, queen c5. So all of this is quite crazy, but it looks like bishop takes g5 would have held. Of course, very, very difficult to calculate, even with a lot of time on the clock, but bishop takes g5 would have held. That being said, I think Jan deserves a lot of credit for this game because he posed some really, really difficult problems to Magnus, and it's rare to see Magnus get into such a difficult position here that he ultimately resigned in. And also, to be fair to white, he did have a few possible better moves earlier, so that the concept of the piece sacrifice really kind of held in this game. So that is today's game of the day, a pretty exciting one. Ultimately, as you may have seen, this game tied the match at 1.5. Magnus decided that a draw was okay in the last game with the white pieces, and then in the blitz tiebreak, it was very close, but Magnus managed to win the blitz tiebreak, and so he's won the first set here of this final match. So on that note, that will be it for today's game of the day. We'll be back tomorrow. I guess you know who the players of the game of the day will be, but we'll see if they come up with as exciting games as they did today. See you all tomorrow.